She told me I could attend my granddaughter's birthday party, but only if I Venmo'd her $200 first for party expenses. I remember standing in my kitchen in Raleigh, phone in hand, reading that text 3 times. Not because I didn't understand the words, because I was trying to figure out how I had gotten here. My granddaughter was turning 5. I had driven 4 hours from Greenville to be there, and my daughter-in-law was charging me admission. My name is Bernard Kowalski. I'm 62 years old. I spent 34 years as a structural inspector for the state of North Carolina, the kind of job where you learn to look for cracks before they become collapses. I retired early when my wife June got sick. June passed 2 years ago, ovarian cancer. From the first symptoms to the end was about 7 months, which is enough time to understand exactly what you're losing, but not enough time to do anything about it. She was the kind of woman who kept a shoebox of birthday cards going back to 1987. She baked from scratch every Sunday. She once spent an entire Saturday helping our neighbor's kid with a science fair project because the kid's mum was working a double shift and nobody else was available. She loved our son fiercely, the way mothers do when they put everything into raising a child, alone for stretches of time when I was working long hours. She adored our granddaughter Piper from the first moment she held her. She used to say Piper had the same stubborn little chin as our son did when he was a baby, which she considered both a warning and a compliment. After June died, I thought the hardest part would be learning to cook something other than scrambled eggs. I was wrong. The hardest part was watching my son slowly disappear into a version of himself I didn't recognize, one careful, apologetic phone call at a time. My son's name is Jeff. He's 38. He works in logistics for a manufacturing company outside of Durham. He married his wife, Renee, about 4 years before June passed. From the beginning, things between Renee and me were polite in the way that certain rooms are clean. Surfaces is white, nothing out of place, no warmth. I told myself that was fine. Some people run cold. I respected their space. I didn't call without texting first. I didn't show up unannounced. When they bought their house in Cary, a nice colonial on a cul-de-sac, I helped Jeff with the down payment. $45,000. The last of a savings account June and I had built over 20 years and never touched, because we always thought we'd use it for something meaningful. I didn't put conditions on it. I didn't ask for paperwork. It was family, and that's what family does. What I didn't know was that Renee had a different way of keeping score. It started small, the way these things always do. The Sunday afternoon visits I'd been making since Piper was born started requiring a few days' notice, then a week. Then I was asked not to bring food because Piper was on a whole foods diet and outside items were a disruption. Then Piper's nap schedule made afternoons difficult, then mornings. Then I drove up one Saturday to find a note on the door that said they'd had a change of plans and would call to reschedule. They didn't call for 11 days. When I mentioned it to Jeff, he said Renee just needed consistency. He said it the way people say things they've been told to say. The text about the birthday party came about 8 months after June died. Renee had sent it directly, not through Jeff, which told me something. The message explained that the party was costing more than expected and that family members who wanted to attend were being asked to contribute to expenses. $200. Venmo. She included her handle. I didn't respond right away. I put the phone down and went and sat on the back porch for a while. It was March, still cold, and the yard looked the way yards do at the end of winter, grey and beaten down, but not quite dead yet. Then I called Jeff. He answered on the second ring, and I could tell from the first syllable that he had been expecting me to call and had prepared something to say. He told me the party was getting expensive. He told me the party was under a lot of stress. He told me I knew how she was. I asked him if he knew what the text said. He paused for a moment too long and said yes. I told him I needed some time to think. I drove back to Greenville that night in the dark, 4 hours with the radio off. And I thought about a lot of things. I thought about the $45,000 sitting under that house in Cary. I thought about a shoebox full of birthday cards and a woman who would have driven through a blizzard to be at her granddaughter's birthday. No invitation required, no charge. I thought about Jeff's face when he was 12 years old, the time he broke a neighbor's window with a baseball, and I walked over with him to apologize and pay for it. And I told him afterward that a man who owns his mistakes doesn't lose sleep. I wondered when that kid had turned into someone who let his wife text his father a Venmo request. I also thought about my neighbor back on Whitmore Street in Greenville, a retired school principal named Harriet who had gone through something similar with her own son's family a few years before. She had found an attorney, a family law specialist in Raleigh named Douglas Finch, who she described as methodical and unshakable, and the kind of man who doesn't raise his voice because he doesn't need to. I had her number still. I had written it down on the back of a hardware store receipt that was in my junk drawer between a dead flashlight and a stack of takeout menus. I called Douglas Finch 2 mornings later. His assistant put me through within the hour. I spent 40 minutes on the phone explaining the situation from the beginning. Douglas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mr. Kowalski, before we talk further, I want you to do 3 things. Write down every visit that was cancelled, delayed or denied, with dates and whatever reason was given. Save every text and email from your daughter-in-law and call your accountant about the $45,000. I asked him why the accountant. He said that money transferred to family members exists in a complicated space under North Carolina law, depending on documentation, intent, and how it was handled at the time. He wanted to understand what financial relationship existed between me and my son's household before anything else. I had used the same accountant since before Jeff was in high school. His name was Robert Ames, out of a small office on Green Street in Greenville, the kind of man who kept paper files and labeled manila folders and had never in 30 years made an error that cost me money. I called him the same afternoon and explained what was happening. He pulled my records going back 6 years. What Robert found was something I had not been paying close enough attention to. The $45,000 I had given Jeff and Renee hadn't just gone toward the down payment. Robert walked me through a chain of transfers using bank statements Jeff had shared with me years earlier during a brief period when we were managing a joint savings account for June's medical expenses. The joint account had been dissolved after June died, but Robert had retained the documentation. A portion of the original funds, roughly $19,000, had moved from their joint checking account into a separate account over about a 16-month period following the house purchase. The transfers were spread out in amounts small enough not to draw immediate attention. Robert could not say with certainty whose name the separate account was in, but the pattern was what it was. I sat in Robert's office for a long time after he showed me the spreadsheet. He offered me coffee and I accepted it, and we sat there together, not saying much. He had known June. He had done her estate filing. He was not the kind of man who said unnecessary things. I thought about Jeff at the Tim Hortons meeting, which is something I hadn't called it then, but was how I'd started thinking of it in my head. The way he'd used that prepared voice. I wondered how much of what he believed about our relationship had been filtered through Renee's version of events. I wondered if he knew about the account. I decided, sitting there, that he probably didn't. That made me feel something I didn't have a word for. Not quite relief and not quite grief. Douglas and Robert worked together over the following 5 weeks. I kept calling ahead for visits. I kept sending Piper little things in the mail, picture books, a small stuffed rabbit, because she had gone through a phase of loving rabbits. Renee let me in for one visit during that period. A Sunday afternoon in April when Jeff was home, and I sat on their grey sectional and watched Piper do a floor puzzle and told her about Cardinal that had started nesting in the holly bush outside my kitchen window. She was at the age where everything is new and everything requires a theory. She wanted to know if the Cardinal knew it was red. I told her I thought it probably had some idea. She considered this seriously and went back to her puzzle. Near the end of the 5th week, Douglas told me we had what we needed. He had prepared a legal demand letter asserting that the $45,000, given the manner in which a portion of the funds had been redirected and the subsequent pattern of access restriction, would be treated as a documented loan and requesting a repayment plan for the full amount. The letter also cited North Carolina General Statute 50-13.2, which addresses grandparent visitation rights, and formally asserted my right to petition the court for reasonable access to Piper if the current pattern continued. The letter was 14 pages, single-spaced, and not one word of it was angry. Robert had prepared a separate financial summary. Every transfer, every date, every amount, the full picture of what had happened to that money, laid out the way a structural report is laid out, clean and factual and impossible to misread. I put both documents in a large manila envelope. I sealed it. I called Jeff and told him I'd like to come by that Saturday as usual. He said that was fine. Renee had already confirmed, he said, though I noticed a slight hesitation in his voice when he said it. I drove to Cary with the envelope on the passenger seat. It was a Saturday in May, warm already the way North Carolina gets warm before most of the country is ready for it. Piper was in the backyard with the sprinkler going. I could hear her before I even got to the door. Renee answered. She was wearing the expression she always wore when I arrived, the one that communicated that everything was under control and she was the reason why. She said Jeff was inside, said Piper was out back, said I should come in. I said I had something for Jeff first. She started to say something about timing, and I said gently that it would only take a moment. Jeff came to the front hallway. He saw the envelope in my hands. Something in his face shifted, something small and fast that I think was instinct before reason could get there. I handed it to him. He opened it in the doorway. Renee was standing just off his shoulder and I watched them both. Jeff read the first page, then the second. His expression went through several things in maybe 30 seconds. Confusion first, then something harder to name. He read the financial summary. He looked up at me. "Dad, what is this?" He didn't say it like a question. He said it like someone who has opened a door he'd been standing in front of for a long time without quite reaching for the handle. "It's a letter from my attorney," I said, "and a financial report from my accountant. I think you'll want to read the whole thing, and then I think you'll want to have a conversation with Renee." He looked at her. She was looking at the envelope. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said. Her voice was careful in the way that careful voices are when the person speaking is working out what they don't know. "Renee," I said, "the transfers are documented. The account is documented. I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here because Jeff deserves to know what's been happening and because I deserve to see my granddaughter. I want to be precise about something. I was not angry. By the time you've been sitting with something for 5 weeks, rebuilding it piece by piece with an attorney and an accountant, the anger has burned off and what's left is very clear and very still. I wasn't performing calm. I was calm. There's a difference." Piper came running in from the backyard at some point, wet from the sprinkler, and threw her arms around Jeff's leg without looking up. He put his hand on her head automatically. "Hi, Pop," she said, which is what she'd called me since she was 2 and couldn't manage Grandpa. "Hey, sweetheart," I said. Jeff looked at me over the top of her head. His expression was something I'd never seen on him before. It was the face of a man who has just understood something he had been given all the pieces of a long time ago. "Come inside," he said. We sat at their kitchen table for almost 3 hours. Renee at first said the transfers were household management, that the money had been set aside for Piper's education, that it was a misunderstanding of how joint accounts work. Jeff listened. He asked questions I hadn't heard him ask before, specific questions. The kind you ask when you've stopped accepting summaries and want the actual numbers. At some point Renee stopped explaining and sat very quietly, the way people do when they've run all the way to the edge of a story and there's nowhere left to go. Jeff called Douglas the following week on his own, not as an adversary, as someone trying to understand what his options were. There were a lot of conversations after that, most of which I was not part of. I don't want to tell Jeff's story for him. That's not mine to summarize. What I can tell you is that 6 months later, Jeff and Renee had separated. Jeff had moved into a rental in Durham, a 2-bedroom place near the park where he used to take Piper on weekends. We had a formal visitation arrangement through the court. I picked Piper up every other Saturday morning and we drove out to Jordan Lake and walked the trails along the water. She had started calling great blue herons the tall birds after I failed to produce the name fast enough the first time she pointed one out, and I had decided I liked her name better. The $45,000 was addressed as part of the separation proceedings. The documented portion was recovered. The $19,000 that moved into the undocumented account was partially recovered, though Douglas advised me that pursuing the remainder further would cost more than it was worth. I agreed. There are things you write off not because you've given up but because you've decided what you're actually fighting for. If you're watching this and something in it sounds familiar, if you're a parent or grandparent sitting somewhere recognizing the shape of what I just described, I want to say something to you directly. What happened to me has a name. It's called financial coercion, and it's one of the oldest tools in the isolation kit. The mechanism is simple. You make someone feel indebted. You make access to their own family conditional on compliance. You present every rule as reasonable, every restriction as temporary, every boundary as self-evident. And the person on the receiving end, if they're the kind of person who doesn't want conflict, who believes that patience is a virtue and that families work things out, will absorb more than they should before they see it clearly. I spent 34 years inspecting bridges and overpasses and parking structures. The work is about finding what's wrong before it becomes a disaster. You don't do that by getting emotional. You do it by documenting, measuring, comparing what you see against what the structure is supposed to look like. I applied the same approach here, not because I'm cold, because the situation required precision. Grandparents have legal standing in North Carolina. Under GS 50-13.2, a grandparent can petition for visitation rights when access has been unreasonably withheld, and it is in the best interest of the child. I didn't know that before I called Douglas Finch. I'm telling you now because you may not know it either. Document money you give to family, not because you distrust them, because documentation protects everyone if something changes. A simple written record of the amount, the date, and whether it's a gift or a loan can be the difference between a conversation and a legal proceeding. I learned that the expensive way, and if you are watching someone you love being slowly edged out of their family, a mother being kept at arm's length from her grandchildren, a father being handed conditions instead of invitations, say something. Do it carefully. Do it without creating a bigger fire than the one you're trying to put out. But say something. Because the person being managed out usually can't see it from inside. They're too busy following the rules. Last month, Piper lost her first tooth while she was with me at my house. She came running downstairs holding it in her palm like it was a piece of gold. We put it in a small envelope and put the envelope under the pillow, and the next morning I left a $2 bill and a note that said the tooth fairy had excellent taste. She made me read the note out loud 4 times. I took a picture and sent it to Jeff and kept one for myself. It's on the refrigerator now, next to the one of June holding Piper in the hospital the week before her diagnosis, both of them looking at each other the way people look when they've just discovered something they didn't know they needed. June would have driven 4 hours each way for that tooth. She would have made a whole event out of it. She would have called her sister and her cousin, and probably the woman from her book club who she'd known since 1994. I think she knew somehow. I like to think she was in the room. I'd been thinking about cause and effect a lot since all of this happened, not in a dramatic way. Just the quiet, practical way you think about things when you've had enough time and enough distance to see the full shape of something. Renee didn't lose her marriage because I hired an attorney. She lost it because she built something on a foundation that couldn't hold. Every rule she added, every visit she shortened, every text she sent asking for money, those weren't just controlling behaviors. They were load-bearing cracks. I spent 34 years finding exactly that kind of damage in bridges and overpasses before they became disasters. The structure looked fine from the outside. It always does, right up until it doesn't. What I want to say, and I mean this plainly, is that doing the right thing is not the same as doing the easy thing. I could have Venmo'd the $200. I could have swallowed it the way I'd swallowed everything else for 2 years. A lot of people in my position do exactly that, and I understand why. You're afraid that if you push back, you lose access entirely. You tell yourself that keeping quiet is keeping the peace. But keeping quiet is not keeping the peace. It's just postponing the reckoning and paying interest on it in the meantime. What got me through those 5 weeks wasn't anger. It was the decision to think clearly instead of react. To call Douglas instead of calling Jeff in the heat of the moment. To let Robert do the math instead of doing it myself from memory in the middle of the night. There is a kind of strength that doesn't look like strength from the outside. It looks like patience. It looks like a man who keeps driving up on Saturdays and following the rules and watching his granddaughter do floor puzzles while he is quietly, methodically building a case. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of discipline there is. The character question underneath all of this is simple. What do you do when someone in your own family treats you as a resource to be managed instead of a person to be loved? The answer I landed on is that you don't match their level. You don't escalate. You document. You consult people who know more than you do. You wait until you have something real in your hands. And then you walk up to the door on a Saturday in May, and you hand your son an envelope, and you let the truth do the work that anger never could. Jeff had to reckon with his own part in this, and that was not easy to watch. He's a good man who spent too long letting someone else make his decisions for him. I don't say that as a criticism. I say it because I've seen what happens when people finally stop. There is a look on a person's face when they stop outsourcing their own judgment, and I saw it on Jeff's face in that doorway, and it was worth every mile I drove and every dollar I paid Douglas and Robert to get there. Piper is going to grow up knowing her grandfather. That's what this was always about. Some things in life come back to you not because you forced them, but because you were honest enough and patient enough and clear-eyed enough to hold your ground until the ground shifted on its own. I don't have a name for that doesn't sound like a bumper sticker. I just know what it felt like standing in that doorway, watching my son read those pages, with my granddaughter's voice coming from somewhere in the backyard. It felt like something that had been wrong for a long time was being set right, quietly, without anyone raising their voice. That's the only kind of right that lasts.